Okay. Thanks, Laura. Welcome to today's IGC event, the impact of COVID-19 in India and pathways to recovery. As we all know that today we are in the midst of this raging pandemic. So this seminar today is the most timely event that we could have, because in one way, it's not only a health issue, but it's an issue which is going to affect for a very long time. I am Ashmita Gupta, an economist and assistant professor at Asian Development Research Institute, Patna, and I will moderate today's session, as you must have already seen. Before we get started, let's review a few things. So all attendees are muted, I think, and in case anyone has a question, please type your question in the Q&A box. And while you type your question, please mention your name and your affiliation. We have a designated time at the end of the discussion where we will be dedicate that time towards answering all the questions. But you can just feel free to type in at any time you have a question. Another thing I would like to just mention before we start is that we are going to record today's session as a video and audio recording, and this will be made available in the IGC website. I also like to point out that there will be a brief survey immediately following today's presentation. So please take a minute to fill that out later on, as your feedback is extremely important. Also, please feel free to contribute to the conversation online by using hashtag IGC COVID-19. Now, the unequal labor market in India has seen widening of disparities after COVID-19 struck. We can expect that the current crisis to accentuate pre-existing inequalities in India's dualistic labor market, which has already been characterized by stark disparities between a small percentage of the workforce that is engaged in formal jobs, offering stability of income and social security benefits, and a disproportionately large proportion engaged in informal employment. COVID-19 will have a lasting impact on labor markets. As much as 18 million Indian workers will be forced to switch to new occupations by 2030 because of the pandemic. The pandemic will make this reskilling challenge more daunting. Its effects will fall heaviest on the most vulnerable groups. Hence, today's event discusses the evidence of the short and long-term impacts of lockdown on labor migrants, policy responses to mitigate labor market risks from the crisis, and coping mechanisms adopted by vulnerable groups. I would now like to welcome Professor Robin Burgess, who's the Director of International Growth Center and Professor of Economics at London School of Economics. So, Robin, over to you now.
Thank you for the introduction and welcome everyone. I wanted to say a few things just to kind of set things in motion. So I guess the first thing is that anyone living through this current pandemic in India, it feels like something that's never happened before. So, you know, daily we hear from research teams, from PhD students, Indian PhD students abroad in India, faculty, about what's happening with their families, what's happening in different parts of India. And it's really something, at least in my lifetime, I haven't seen the kind of the severity of this shock. So I think it's certainly, as Ashmita said, a timely event, and I think the fact that the shock is so severe makes it more important, because what is happening to me feels unparalleled to certainly what I've ever seen happen within India. So I think what we already know is that the kind of throwing back of people into poverty, and not just into poverty, but people who are middle class falling back is something that was already occurring, and obviously with the current increase in cases and so on, that will happen more and more. So then the question, and there's various numbers put out, like 1/3 of people who came out of poverty have been thrown back. 32 million people who are in the middle class have been thrown back. But from the perspective of today and the coming days proceedings, I think the big thing is, well, what does one do about that? And I think the set of papers that deal with the labor market, with households, with health and well-being are all incredibly relevant, because of course this shock is not just a health shock, it's also an economic shock. So it's an enormous shock on both health and in terms of livelihoods. So I think what's exciting about the agenda is there's going to be a bunch of papers in those three areas where we can begin to think about what might be appropriate policy responses, and how that research can inform policies going forward. So I think one thing that, I've been working in India basically since the early 90s, and the IGC has been there since 2009, both in Delhi and in Bihar and elsewhere, is that there is something about this shock that will, I think, prompt new thinking, is I guess one way to say it. That it's kind of exposed, the obvious thing it exposed is the weakness of the health system, but it's exposed many other things. It's exposed the fact that social protection is not particularly strong or resilient. It's exposed the fact that many Indians live in, work in jobs that are highly insecure. And so I think there is also an opportunity here to kind of rethink. I guess one way to put it, there is going to be a greater impetus for reform, because every Indian, not just the poor, have experienced the kind of failings on things like the health system, social protection, and so forth. And I think people will want change. They will want a reform. So hopefully the proceedings in the next few days can inform what policies might be appropriate. So what is interesting is, I think the types of policies, as Ashmita was already saying, are not just like what's going to happen next month. They're going to be about deeper reforms, what's needed. And it's great to have Deepak Kumar Singh, who is responsible for climate change and that, because there is also, I think, coming with this health and economic shock, a kind of a reassessment of many areas, including how do we build more sustainable growth, how do we build cleaner growth, how can we build growth that's more equitable in India. So there's a kind of, hopefully, a path forward where Indians can continue to become better off, but the kind of externalities and environmental damages from that growth don't again lead to other shocks which may push people back into poverty. So I think there's a kind of a crossroads for India, but I think that crossroads will lead to some quite deep-seated reforms, which are sort of focused more on sustainable and equitable growth. And I think that might be a good thing, because many of these failings have been apparent for some time, but we needed this huge shock to sort of push to create more impetus for reform. So I think the final thing, apart from looking forward to the proceedings the next few days, is to say that we're very grateful to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for funding much of this work over the last year, and for our partners in ADRI for helping to convene this in Coronet. So I think without further ado, I'd like to welcome everyone, and I look forward to hearing the various presentations under the labor markets, household, and health and well-being segments. So welcome everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. I think this webinar couldn't have been uh, put in context in a better way, because you rightly said that today we're looking at the effect of COVID on labor markets, but it's not only a labor market issue, it's a health issue, it's an environment issue, and possibly everything for it could have intergenerational consequences, which we are possibly going to see in the households next part of the phase tomorrow or the day after. So I think it's going to keep economists busy for possibly the next 10 years or so. And we also would need to have more interdisciplinary approaches. But as of now, today, we will talk about the impact on COVID on labor markets, and we'll explore policy measures and solutions that are needed to address the deteriorating conditions of employment and widening disparities in the labor market. And we will have 3 brief presentations. And after the presentations, we will go into a general discussion where Mr. Deepak Kumar Singh, who is the Principal Secretary, Environment, Forest and Climate Change, and he was also a former Principal Secretary in the Labor Department. He would we'll have a discussion with him and all our other speakers, who are Farzana Afridi, professor at Indian Statistical Institute, and she's also the lead academic at the IGC India. We have Dr. Swati Dhingra, who's assistant professor of economics at London School of Economics. And we have Clément Imbert, who is an associate professor at University of Warwick. So now I invite Professor Swati Dhingra to start her presentation. Swati will present key findings on a project on informal workers and labor market risk during COVID-19 in India. The study has examined which economic policies are likely to be most effective in mitigating the imminent loss in living standards for the vast majority of informal workers whose livelihoods are at risk due to the pandemic. So thank you very much. Now over to you, Swati.
Great, thanks so much, Ashwata. So I'm going to talk about urban labor markets during COVID-19 in India. This is work that started off as an LSE-CEP partnership and has now sort of got IGC involved as well. So let me start with 2 motivating facts, since I'm the first speaker. The first fact is that the World Bank estimates that 119 to 224 million people this year will become poor, and a lot of them will be concentrated in urban areas. South Asia is expected to contribute 60% to these new poor who are coming into being. What has happened in urban labor markets in India, I know most of you are aware of or would have read about the huge unemployment losses, huge unemployment that's happened. What is sort of well documented now through the Periodic Labor Force Survey of India is that it's much bigger than probably we thought or anticipated. And therefore, what has happened really is that, in particular for young workers, the urban unemployment rate has gone up year on year by about 12 to 13 percentage points. So we're talking about a sort of crisis that is immense and deep. And a lot of other countries have already started labor market policies, which are designed to be active labor market policies to address the unemployment crises in their countries. Urban labor markets in India sort of lag behind in some sense, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the issues which are there, as well as what is it that workers would like to see to be able to address the unemployment crisis. So our project really is a labor market survey in low-income urban areas of India. We started off in 2018 with an all-India survey. And as the pandemic grew, we realized that it was better to focus it on to younger workers who are most at risk of long-term unemployment. And the reason we care about long-term unemployment is because of the immense consequences for lifelong earnings, for employment prospects, as well as the mental well-being and other sources of well-being for the community as a whole. So what this project does is to interview 18 to 40-year old workers in these particular urban wards of Bihar, Jharkhand, and Uttar Pradesh, which are three low-income states in India. The first wave was done immediately after, unfortunately, it's called first wave, but immediately after the first wave of the pandemic as well, between May to July 2020. And we interviewed about 5,500 individuals to get a sense of what is it that they would like to see in terms of employment policies. We focused it now much more onto a smaller fraction of those people being re-interviewed and a set of unemployed individuals who lost work due to the pandemic, sort of a boost sample of these new individuals who've come into the wave, to be able to think much more carefully about what is it in terms of government policy that would matter for them. So the first wave started with about 5,500 individuals from these three states, and the second wave is going to re-interview 60% of those individuals, and then also expands the sample to a set of unemployed individuals. So I'm going to talk about what we found in the first wave. I'm only showing you the Recontact sample because these are the more recent findings, which have come in fairly recently. Still undergoing review from the IGC, and hopefully it should be out fairly soon. So the Recontact sample of about 3,000 plus individuals, what we found in April to June 2020, 29% of them were out of work, either because they were made unemployed, they had dropped out of the labor force, or they were working 0 hours in the week before the survey. I want to point out that the sample that we constructed were all individuals who had employment before the pandemic. So they have lost their jobs since the pandemic started, since about Jan-Feb 2020. By April to June 2020, during the sort of first wave of the pandemic, when April there was the full national lockdown, 80% of these individuals had no work or no pay during a full month, or even a bit more, in fact, most cases. We went and we re-interviewed them again more recently in Jan to March 2021, and certainly things have improved since then. We, of course, this is not post the second wave of the pandemic, but what we realized was that there were still many who continued to be unemployed or to receive no pay. About half of the people that were recontacted were still out of work or pay. And if you focus in a bit more in terms of who particularly are hurt, once again, the younger cohort amongst these and the ones who had lower incomes to begin with before in their pre-COVID job, these are the individuals who see even bigger losses in terms that 47% of them find themselves without work or pay. I also want to point out that amongst the people who are employed, there's also been a reduction in hourly work, which is to say that they're working on average, they're working 6 hours less per week, and almost half of them, who would otherwise typically tell you that they work full year, that number, that rate of working full year has halved. We also interviewed sort of the Recontact sample as well as the boost sample to get a sense of what is happening in terms of unemployment. And this is sort of the more recent news which comes in, that long-term unemployment the risk of it seems to have set in already. On average, the unemployed individuals have been looking for work for about 6 months, which brings them to the sort of category of at risk of long-term unemployment. And this was already that they had been looking for work. Of course, now with the second wave of the pandemic going on, this is potentially going to be even longer. The next slide then sort of reports results from the survey in terms of asking people what is it that they would like to see, as if they do want to at all see active labor market policies in urban areas, and if they do, what would be the sorts of policies that they would like to see. So the table that you can see here is for both the Recontact and the boost sample, about 4,500 individuals. We've split them into those who are employed and those who are unemployed. And the first question really sort of asks them very specifically to pick between what they would like to see, an urban job guarantee or a cash transfer. And an overwhelming proportion of them would like to see a job guarantee over a cash transfer, while still a sort of reasonable fraction of them would prefer a cash transfer over a job guarantee. And the reasons that they provide in terms of why they would like to see, say, for example, an urban job guarantee is because of the lack of work that it addresses directly, as well as the livelihood security that it provides. While if you go to the cash transfer answers, they're much more sort of, again, fairly sensible answers in terms of that they would like to see cash transfers because they're much more flexible, and particularly for people who would be able to sort of want to work elsewhere. We also sort of made workers think a little bit more carefully about, amongst a broader set of policies, what is it that they would like to see? And here we see once again that about 80% plus would prefer job guarantees, about 16% would like to see cash transfers, and barely sort of 0.1 to 1% choose anything else, which are things like hiring incentives for firms, wage subsidies, land grants, etc. Overwhelmingly, those who want to see a job guarantee also want the government to be the one to be stepping in to provide these kinds of job opportunities. There's also sort of other labor market policies that we can think of, which are very much on the agenda of the Indian government and which have recently either been enacted or are things which are sort of on the cards in some sense. So 40% say that they know the minimum wage levels, which seems like a fairly low number, but I can tell you that I personally don't know the minimum wage level in my state for my type of job, and so on and so forth. There are just thousands of minimum wages in India. So these people say that they know the level, and those that amongst them who know the level also say that 54% of them think that the minima are too low. About 50% of people also say that they would like to be members of a trade union if there were one available to them. And less than 1% have in fact received the government benefits which are designed to be active labor market policies, such as the Employees Provident Fund accounts or the Employees State Insurance accounts. So less than 1% of them had any government card which was related to these sorts of programs. We can also move on and make this much more specific and force people to think a little bit more in terms of how much do they actually value these kinds of active labor market policies. So there's a well-established tradition both in environmental economics as well as in labor economics, where willingness to pay is calculated based on sort of survey experiments. And this is exactly what we tried to do in the work that we did in April to June, and more recently, is to ask people that if they were to choose between two jobs that are identical in all respects, except for the wage and the number of days guaranteed that it provides, then what is it that they would like to choose? So job A would give them whatever their usual wage that they reported to us was in terms of their pre-COVID job, and would offer them that pre-COVID job at that particular wage rate. And job B would then say that you would get the usual wage marked down by a certain percentage, and that certain percentage was randomly generated by us from anywhere between 0% less, which means you get the same wage, or 40% less than the usual wage that these workers get. So this is an example of that sort of screen in English, of course, which is showing that job A is giving you 300 rupees, no guarantee of any set days of work. And if you look at job B, that's marking it down and bringing it to 240 rupees. And that markdown was sort of randomly generated by the survey software. And you would be guaranteed 100 days of work, and you're supposed to sort of pick which one you would like to choose. And this is broadly what we find from it, which is that the x-axis is showing you the markdown, which is 0 if you get the same wage, and 40% less if you get the minus 0.4. What proportion of people choose is what's being reported on the y-axis. And from here, what we can calculate based on a logistic regression is what is the median willingness to pay for job B, which guarantees you 100 days of work.
Swati, sorry to interrupt you, but you need to hurry up a bit.
Sure. So what we find is that people are willing to pay 25% of their usual wages to be able to get a guaranteed set of days of work, which is a sizable proportion compared to when many of these types of experiments are run with, say, gig workers and the likes. What we also find is that if we compare workers who had a job guarantee in their pre-COVID job versus workers who did not, you see that the employment outcomes and the earnings losses were much lower for workers who had a job guarantee in their pre-COVID job. So in that sense, the experimental evidence is consistent with also the observational evidence. So let me conclude here with saying that which, if any, active labor market policies do urban individuals want? Overwhelmingly, they do want some form of active labor market policy. These range from job guarantees, cash transfers, minimum wages, as well as unionization. So as the second wave of the pandemic unfolds, what we're going to see is possibly that many of these young individuals would have already been pushed into a long-term trajectory of unemployment. And therefore, what is really going to be important is being able to put in place active labor market policies that prevent these people from becoming a lost generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this, Swati. I hope to come back to you while we have our discussion. Now, I'll quickly move on to Clément, who is going to present about the short and long-term impacts of India's national lockdown on young rural migrants in Bihar and Jharkhand. So, Clément, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Let me get this back. Hopefully, okay. I'll be able to share my screen. Yes, so yeah, thanks for inviting me to speak about rural migrants and COVID-19. This research has benefited from funding from IGC, so we're very grateful. And indeed, we think of this research as being quite important for the current situation. So when I say rural young migrants, COVID-19, you might have this picture in mind or something similar. So this picture from last March. From rural migrants being stuck in urban areas that are usually attractive for rural migrants. That's where the jobs are. That suddenly became hotspots of the virus, and where the factories and the service companies closed, so that the jobs were not there anymore. What made it, of course, extremely difficult was that, at least for initially, all travel was restricted. So there were no buses and trains, and people walked by foot. This was, of course, gradually eased, and there were many people coming back. So this presentation will be thinking about this initial period, but also following them until today. It will probably not be able to, I will not be able to say much about the potential effect of the second wave that we see now. So, as I said, I think this image of rural migrants walking home was one of the most striking images of the first lockdown, and so this raises many questions, which is we've seen anecdotal evidence and images, but how many were stuck and how many went home? Have they, if they went home, have they migrated back since? Have they gone back to work in urban areas? And then what will happen now, which I may have little to say about. So just to quickly to say that national representative data on migration is not available for recent years. And I've written in a blog post, at the time of the lockdown, that I would guess that about 11 million people, interstate migrants, would go home. And it turns out that counting the number of passenger trains and buses that were arranged by the different states, it does seem that the total is about 11 million. But in this talk, I will present results from a panel survey of rural migrants that we started in 2019. And the last round was completed a week ago. So actually, some people from IGC have been chasing us to get the results, but that's very much the first time we're presenting them. So I wanted to first, as a way of background to our study, but also as a way of thinking about the types of policies that are in place to help the rural poor access urban jobs. I wanted to say a few words about the DDGY training program, which we've been studying for a while now. So DDGY stands for Deen Dayal Upadhyay Gramin Kaushal Yojana. And it is a program that offers short-term training and placement into salary job to a rural disadvantaged youth. And those are defined as coming from below poverty line households. They have some education, but not often not tertiary education, and there are quotas for female and SC/ST. And the rationale for that program is precisely that it is difficult for rural migrants, especially for female and low caste, to get access to good jobs in urban areas. And this program is precisely trying to achieve this, and has done this on a large scale with 1 million youth trained, 500,000 placed since 2014. So we've been working with the two states of Bihar and Jharkhand. Our partners are BSLPS, JSLPS, so Vika from those two states, and the Ministry of Rural Development. And this data is collected as part of an effort of doing several experiments to try to help placements of those trainees, before and after the lockdown happened. But I won't be reporting on those experiments just yet. So the sample we have is 1/3 from Jharkhand, 2/3 from Bihar. The level of education as expected is relatively low, so 30% 10th grade, 50% 12th grade. We have a large share of women and many SC and ST, which suggests that really this program is indeed helping out disadvantaged rural workers. And I'll be reporting on 3 rounds of survey. One that refers to the pre-lockdown period, March 2020, although part of it was collected just as the lockdown was going on. One round of survey that we did after lockdown eased in June, July 2020, and one which is basically 1 year after the lockdown in March, April 2021. So just now, the attrition is slowly rising, but we think we still have reasonable coverage. I should also mention my co-authors, Bhaskar Chakravarti, Max Lonet, Poonam Panda, Purav Bhajan, and Rohan Ratlo, and funding from EquiPSLC, Warwick, and IGC. So I'm going to be showing you just basically a few of those graphs. They're called alluvial plots, and we've come to love them, but it takes a bit of time to get used to. So here you have those 3 surveys that we have. This is the pre-lockdown situation. This is the June, July 2020 situation, and this is the current situation as of March and April 2021. And we are following our sample across those different waves and categorizing them in those 3 types of employment. As in the first category, the blue one, are people who were not earning even before the lockdown. The middle category are people doing casual work, so informal work. And the last category are salary jobs, so good formal jobs with contract and benefits. So if you focus very simply on comparing this as if it were a bar chart, and comparing the pre-lockdown situation and the current situation, you see that there's a bit more people not earning today than they were pre-lockdown, but the big change is that there's a lot more people having a good formal job. Okay, this is going down; it's almost halved. Okay. Of course, what's really interesting in this graph is also sort of the movement and the dynamics. And you see that a lot of people who had a good formal jobs actually left it and went into the not earning situation after the lockdown, and that not that many of them were able to go back to a salary job. You see also some people who managed to retain their salary job even after the lockdown, but who have now lost it. Okay, so that's basically the main thing that's going on. Now, if I'm looking at this by gender, I think there's a pretty striking feature there, which is that for female, and you should probably remember that of course female labor force participation is very low in India. So for women, it might be this salary job given by the DDGY program might really be one of the few opportunities they'll get for this type of job. And you see that actually quite a few of them actually retain this job even after the lockdown, but you see that they lost it. Most of them have lost it by now. The picture for male is different, and for male, there's a lot more casual work going on. There's a lot more informal work, and what's happening is that as male are actually transitioning from good formal jobs to basically a lot of informal jobs, very often basically at home. I'll come to the migration in a minute. So basically, women transitioning from good jobs to basically not earning, so doing housework, and men transition from good jobs, side job, to a lot of casual work. Now on the migration, turning to the migration, so hopefully now you're used to those charts, we're looking at people being at home. So it is the case that although many, all of those young people were trained and offered a job, it's not, many of them, sorry, I should have said, they come from behind jobs, so a lot of these formal jobs are outside of the state. But, many of them actually were still at home before the lockdown. You see that the big change, of course, is many of them, so there's many more of them at home after the lockdown. And that comes from people who were outside of state and came back. And, as we follow them over time, you see that, even as of March and April, of course, some people did go back to migrating outside of the state, but, a few of them, really few of them did. And then, looking at this by female, there's a picture that's they're quite comparable, meaning women coming back after the lockdown, and then especially between June and July and March and April 2021, and similar picture for me. So I still have two graphs I still have two graphs to show you. This one is about trying to get a bit about like aspirations, because I've shown you, where people are. The question is, whether they're still looking to migrate again or not. So looking at people who were migrating, who were outside of state before the lockdown, you see that many of them, as we saw, came back home, and a large fraction of them actually is at home and just wants to stay there. So what's going on here, and if you're looking at the current situation, is that even more people are at home and want to stay there. This, at the opposite end of the spectrum, those are people who are outside of the state, who have migrated and want to stay there, like not go back home at all. And this fraction has just, was very small after the lockdown and has just gone almost to zero in the current situation, meaning out of the people who are still outside of states, many now want to come back. So that really suggests that migration aspirations in this population have gone down by a lot. And I think given the situation that that's what it has ended in urban areas, I think it's pretty understandable. And the final graph or the final figure I wanted to show was about mental well-being. And so we've been asking questions about life satisfaction or anxiety. I'll focus on those two. You see that life satisfaction that was pretty high pre-lockdown has taken a big hit post-lockdown and has been bouncing back up, but nowhere close to the levels that it had. And in terms of anxiety, you can that's a similar picture at 36% here of people feeling anxious in the last week pre-lockdown. That's gone up to 44%, and it's now 42%. So it is the case that the mental, the well-being situation is very close to the labor market situation for that generation. So, in conclusion, I guess Swati has painted the picture for urban labor markets, and she's really emphasized the need for active labor market policies for urban workers. You should probably double that for rural migrants. It is hard to get good urban jobs for rural migrants in the best of times, and especially for female and local workers. There are policies in place that can help with this, like this training and placement program, which is DDGY. But of course, due to COVID-19, as we've seen, many of those rural migrants have lost their jobs and eventually gone home when they could. We've seen some evidence that they engage with labor market again, and some did migrate between since the summer basically. But 1 year later, the feeling is really that still at home. And most importantly, perhaps they seem to have given up on the idea of migrating interstate again. And so with the second wave, it would be just even harder to integrate them back into the urban labor markets. And since we're talking about migrant labor, I couldn't help but also highlight the fact that in the current political climate, there seems to be increasing restriction on interstate migration. So with the states imposing quotas on native or state workers. So things are not looking very good for the future for those rural migrants.
Thanks, Clement. I would now invite Farzana to present her study on immediate and medium-term impact of COVID on livelihoods, income, food security, mental and physical health in urban informal sector workers in India. Farzana, over to you.
Can you see the screen now?
Yes, I can see it.
Great. So thank you for having me. So this is a project that has been in the works for quite some time now. But before I get into the details of the project itself, first I want to put into perspective the aggregate labor market impacts of COVID-19. And this is coming from the Center for Monitoring of the Indian Economy, the Consumer Pyramids Survey, which is our only source of having high frequency data on general employment in India now. And so what we see essentially here in terms of the first graph, so we were looking at what was the employment levels in 2019 and then what happened in 2020. So this data goes up till August of 2020. And what we essentially see is that there was this big dip in terms of the proportion of people who were employed. So that fell from about an average of 40% to 30%, so about a 10 percentage point fall. And then it increased when we moved from the strict lockdown to June, when the lockdown started easing, and then we had further easing of the lockdown from August onwards in India. And then when we look at the urban and the rural and disaggregate the data by that, then essentially what it's telling us is that more or less the shock was similar between the urban and the rural areas when we compare 2019 with 2020. But in terms of levels, we know that employment generally is much higher in rural areas because a lot of people would classify themselves as self-employed. In agriculture in particular, and also women's employment tends to be higher in rural areas, again, because of self-employment in agriculture. To some extent, we can say that the shock was probably more severe somewhat in urban areas than it was in rural areas in terms of loss of employment. And finally, when we look at it in terms of gender here, so we're looking at this in terms of unconditional on their previous employment status. So we're looking at men and women, irrespective of whether they were employed or not in 2019. And what you can see again is that the shock seemed to have been impacted men more severely than women. But of course, it's true that conditional on women being employed previously before the pandemic, if they were already working, then the probability that they dropped out of the labor force as a result of the pandemic was higher for women than it was for men. So that's like, the picture that we have. And of course, things are going to look much more dramatic and probably much more magnified when we think of 2021. And I think those data are just trickling in. But now to get into this micro study that has been funded by the IGC and also by the Initiative for What Works for Women to Advance Women and Girls in the Economy. So this is joint work that I've been doing with Amrita Dhillon and Sanchari Roy, where we've been following a random sample of urban poor who are primarily informal workers who are residing near industrial clusters in 5 out of the 10 districts that we have in Delhi. And we started as a household survey. It's a random sample of household surveys where then we went in and did a detailed individual level survey of a husband and wife pair who were in the age group of 18 to 45. So that gives us roughly more than 3,000 individuals who are residing in these approximately 1,600 households in the urban clusters of Delhi. So we started the survey in May, July in 2019, where we conducted detailed in-person interviews. And then it so happened that when we were doing our midline, then the lockdown happened and we had to switch to a phone survey. And unfortunately, we couldn't ask all of these questions to all the wives and the women in the survey. The reason being that very often women do not have their own phones, and we have to sort of maneuver our way through the men in the household. So primarily this was self-reported data coming from the husbands, but there is a part of the survey, particularly the emotional and the mental well-being, where we directly also spoke to the wives of these husbands, of these men. And then we have these post-COVID-19 lockdown, which is August and October 2020, we conducted the third round of the phone survey, and we are currently in the field conducting our final round, which started in April, just before the curfew happened in Delhi. So we've completed about 40% of that, and then now we've switched to the phone survey because it's not anymore, it's not possible physically to continue. So this is our sample. And so basically what you see over here is that when we talk about the impact on working status, so whether you are currently working or not, and this could be temporary loss of work or permanent, what we see is that, most of this fall that we saw was temporary, going from pre-COVID to during the lockdown. And then I shouldn't call this post-COVID, is post-lockdown, which is the third phase. There is some gain in improvement in the working status, but it doesn't come back to the initial pre-pandemic levels. And similarly for women, we see a fall, but as you can see for them, we don't have the midline data available. Now, impact on monthly earnings, again, dramatic falls that we observe for men in terms of their monthly earnings, and then a recovery, but not again a full recovery. And then also for women, this is unconditional on their working status, so it's already very low and it falls further. What about the kinds of households or the kinds of occupations that are being, that had been affected? It seems that casual workers were able to recover much more in terms of their earnings relative to the self-employed or the salaried, and that holds true both for the men as well as the women in the sample. And this is of course conditional on their having been in the workforce before the pandemic struck. And another aspect of our work, which is important, was to look at the mental health. And what we see is that, so this left-hand side, we look at the midline. So this is during the lockdown. So this is April, May of 2020. And then the end line, which is the August-October survey that we did. And what you can see very clearly is that persistently very high levels of anxiety, stress, and depression, and also as a result of financial stress. And in regression analysis that we run, we find that women are significantly much more adversely affected relative to men. And so when we want to think about pathways to recovery, one of the things that strikes us, and this speaks to what Swati was mentioning, is employment guarantee programs. And what I wanted to point out over here is that the Rural Employment Guarantee Program, which is NREGA in India, of course, caters only to the rural areas. It does not cater to the urban areas. And what we found is that even though self-reported working status fell by over 85 percentage points and continued to remain lower by 14 percentage points post-lockdown, relative to pre-crisis for men, and also women's self-reported working status fell by 10 percentage points relative to pre-crisis. All of this is happening in urban areas. And if you go, if you recollect the first slide that I showed, which shows a significantly greater negative impact in urban areas, we don't have the presence of social security programs or social protection programs in urban areas, which will be able to stem or cushion the loss of jobs as they happened in the in the urban areas. And so basically what I wanted to say from this is that we need to think about employment guarantee and social protection programs which cater, which match with, or you're not disconnected with the relative magnitudes of the impacts by demographic groups and by geography. Thank you.
Thanks, Farzana. And thanks to all the panelists for 3 excellent presentations. We hope to come back to some of them in our discussion. So now I'd move on to our panel, where I would like to ask Mr. Deepak Kumar Singh, what policy measures have been put in place to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on the labor market? Mr. Singh.
Thank you, Ashmita. It was a very nice presentation by Robin, Farzana, Clement, and Swati, and it was very nice. It was very informative and based on the field data. Now about this thing, you see the policy initiatives which were taken by Government of India post the lockdown and to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on the labor market were basically 3 types. First was the food security measures, in which the free foods were given based on through the PDS, and all the PDS card holders, they were benefited by this. The second was a cash dole, although it was very insufficient, but an amount of cash dole which was transferred through the Jan Dhan account and to the farmers to the Kisan Samman Yojana. And third was basically the generating the local work by increasing the allocation for Manrega and also increasing the allocation and expediting the work under various other departments program, like as I have seen in the forest department program also, and similarly for other departments program, whether it's a road department program or other programs, so that these workers get employment back home who had come back after the COVID crisis from the places where they had gone. So basically these were the 3 measures which were taken, Asmita.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. And also, what do you think are the further measures that are required to avoid the deepening inequalities in this situation, and so that it reaches the most vulnerable groups post-pandemic?
You see, Arpita, the basic thing is that when we talk about the effects of the lockdown, or when we talk about the lockdown, the unorganized workers and migrant workers is of course a subset of that unorganized workers. They are the last priority in any narrative. When last year the lockdown was announced, no one talked about the impact on the migrant workers or the unorganized workers. It is only when the disturbing visuals and the distressing visuals started coming in the newspapers and in the media that all these measures they were initiated. Similarly, when we talk about the economic impact of the lockdown, no one talks about this sector. We very easily say that work from home, forgetting that there are many people who don't have a home as such. So where will they work from? That is number 1 thing. And second, they are not in a kind of job where they can work from home. Now, what I feel, you see the basic issue in unorganized sector of workers, the recommendations by all the panelists who have given their presentations are extremely good. But one basic thing which comes in the implementation of any social security measure for the unorganized sector is number 1, their estimation, and number 2 is their identification and registration. You see, this sector was never in limelight until the NCEUS, the National Commission on the Employment in Unorganized Sector, that commission that was formed in 2004 and which gave various reports ending with the last report in 2008. and based on which the Unorganized Workers Social Security Act was formed in 2008, although in a much diluted way than what the Commission had recommended. And unfortunately, even after 13 years of 12 years of that act, nothing happened as far as the registration of workers under that act is concerned, because that was the primary thing which was required for extending any kind of benefit. In between, there are several schemes which has been started for the Social Security, Pradhan Mantri Jeevan Jyoti Suraksha Yojana, Atal Pension Yojana, Pradhan Mantri Shram Yogi Mandhan Yojana. All these programs have been, Jan Dhan accounts, all these programs have been started. The basic issue with all the programs is that every program starts with their own registration process. So we don't have a common database of the unorganized set of workers, and therefore extending any kind of benefit to them is very difficult. That is number two. As far as the job guarantee schemes are concerned, for example, Manrega, or if we extend it to urban sector also, the wage levels in Manrega is so low. I don't know about other states, but in Bihar, which is otherwise has a low minimum wages, even in Bihar, the Manrega wages are at least 100 rupees low than the minimum wages of the state. And it is only that the state government supplements something from their own budget. So this job guarantee programs cannot be a substitute for their social security. So the first thing, the first riddle which we have to solve is how to register them all. One of the way can be is to make it mandatory for any kind of payment to any of the worker in the unorganized sector through their bank accounts. So that can be one way through which we can at least track as to who is an unorganized worker. Because currently, but even then, the problem will be that there are in unorganized workers, there are many people who are self-employed also. So in their case, it will be difficult. So this is some kind of a riddle which I think I have been in the labor department for 3.5 years, but I was not able to find out a quick solution to this issue as to how to register them, because that is the first process. You see, the Unorganized Workers Social Security Act, it was enacted in 2008. There was just one section in the rules of that act which talked about registration, and that was never operationalized in 12 years. Then it was subsumed in the new Social Security Code. In the new code also, it has been, as it is, it has been taken the old act into the new code also. And even there is no provision for, there is no roadmap as to how we will go about registering them. So I think that is the first thing. Second, what I would like to comment about the study about DDGY and other, what I have found out is one thing which didn't come out in the study. Of course, the data said that as compared to the number of people who have been trained, the number of people who have been placed in the employment is minuscule and negligible. But we have to find out the reasons why it is so. The main reason behind that is that the skilling sector in India, of course, the unfortunate part is that the entire skilling sector, the devising of courses, the certification, everything has been given to a body which is not a government body. These are sector skill councils, which consist of industry representatives only. But even then, the process of getting a new course sanctioned is such a tedious job, then that is why it happens that the courses which are actually being trained, they are not in consonance with the actual requirement of the industry in the field, and that is why these people don't get employment. And it is an artificial kind of an thing, making it mandatory to do 300 hours. Even the things which require 80 hours of training, they have been extended to 300 hours or 400 hours of training, and resulting in that lack of interest of the trainees also. And secondly, because they are not in consonance with the industry requirement, these people don't get employment actually in the field. Nobody is ready to pick up them. So this process has to be looked into as to how the courses are designed, how they can be framed, and how they can be quickly changed as the technology changes in the industry. Only then we can keep pace of the trained students with the placed students. So anyway, I mean, these are some of the points which I wanted to say, and in anything else which comes in the Q&A section, then I will say. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Kumar. I think these are some of the very crucial points from the policy perspectives. I would now like to turn to some of the panelists and would like to ask them if they would like to address some of the issues that have been raised by Mr. Kumar, and also, for example, this entire question of informal sector, the issue of how to identify, first of all, and how to the target group, and how could the new regime and framework for social security and protection be designed so that it reaches the target group, and particularly women and people belonging to the scheduled castes and tribes. Would some of the panelists like to answer this?
I think Farjana wants to answer it.
Yes, Farzana.
So I was on a panel discussion just before joining this one. And one of the things that was put forth, because this is a report that is being published, which is cumulative data coming from different sources and different surveys, that even if you're able to identify certain households or beneficiaries, for example, when you look at the Jan Dhan Yojana, 30% of these transfers apparently are not reaching the targeted beneficiaries. So given that, we have this structure, the architecture of Aadhaar present, still there seem to be some reasons why there are leakages, because of which a substantive proportion of these households which have been identified. So for example, with Jan Dhan Yojana, which they should be getting, 30% or so are not. And I think we've got this from various states, and it's not just Bihar. There's from Karnataka, from Rajasthan, from Madhya Pradesh. So that's one thing. So given that we've been able to identify some, why is it that we are not able to reach everybody? And the second, I think, larger issue is when it comes to NREGA, for instance, a simple solution would be, for instance, to raise the minimum wage, or rather the minimum wage on NREGA, right? So why is it that certain states have not raised the wage, which has been a demand from many in the field, as well as many activists and so on, that in a situation like this, identification of those who need it most is going to be tricky. And given that we do not have the infrastructure and we have not created the architecture for that, we need to move to a paradigm where there is universalization of these benefits. So what is the government thinking in terms of moving towards universalization, and at the same time sort of bridging these, or plugging these leakages that exist in systems for identification that already exist?
Thanks, Farzana. I think that is an extremely important point, and so far that is what has been, I think, propagated by most of the policy advisors. And I hope that government would listen to this and think in this direction. And another important point that was raised by Mr. Singh, and also which came up in the presentations, was about technology upskilling and providing the opportunities. So how does the rural-urban divide impact job readiness of the programs? And are there any steps that are taken to bridge this gap? So this question is directed to all the panelists. I think Swati, would you like to respond to that? Or Clement? Okay.
Maybe quickly on the training, because I guess that was part of these things I talked. So just to, I guess I want to say a few good things about policies in India, and especially in Bihar, both with regard to training and with regard to registration and with regard to social protection, including for migrants. So I certainly did not say that the placement records are abysmal in DDGY. Actually, they're very high as compared to expectations. They're not 100%, but they're at least 50% after 6 months. So it's not bad. So this DDGY program is, I think, one good example of what could be done in response to your last question, Ashmita, about what could be done to bridge the gap. So it is the case, the gap between rural and urban areas, and helping rural workers get the skills and the opportunities to get the jobs. The way, of course, Mr. Singh is completely right in his general skepticism of training programs. Very often training programs, there's no placement, the skills have nothing to do with what employers want. In the DDGY program, the placement is guaranteed and the training providers have agreed with an employer before starting the training. So I wanted to give maybe a more positive view of that program because we've been studying for quite a while. And I think it has identified a crucial gap in the labor markets in India, and it is able to provide opportunities. I wanted to say a few words about, because part of our sample is actually Bihar migrants, that the Bihar government has, seeing how difficult it was for migrant workers who indeed were not registered wherever they were working or living, and the general package, indeed for ration cards. There were some attempts by the government to try to go through construction worker associations, and all of this, as Mr. Singh really explained, basically couldn't cover all the unorganized and the migrant. And actually, the Bihar government had an ABDA program where it was asking migrant workers to register through their mobile app and sending them money. And we find that 61% of the migrants in our sample actually received that help. Of course, that's nowhere sufficient to get people through an extended period of time. So that's where I think this discussion of social protection is very important. And I think both Swati and Fazana has been talking about an urban guarantee. I think I'm evaluating an urban guarantee program in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. So those programs in urban areas exist and can work. And of course, the rural employment guarantee, which was the big safety net, one of the big safety net coming from response to labor market shocks. It exists, but it has been, as has been said, restricted in its ability to help the poor by lower minimum wages, small, shorter budget allocations. So there is, what I mean is that there is, it seems to me that there's definitely the political awareness of those issues. There might be some infrastructure that are already there. So, definitely on the rural employment side, I think there are, just to say that the registration problems are not impossible to fix. Our partner at GVK and BSLPS actually, ask all this local female staff who work for this Confederation of Microfinance to go out. They went out in the villages in the middle of the pandemic to register new poor households. So those things can be done in complement, of course, to others. So they can be done. They have been done. It's really a matter of putting it at scale and giving this infrastructure, as what the other speakers have really explained, a universal dimension, meaning maybe a rural basis, an urban basis, and some possibility for migrants to this portability of social benefits, which is social entitlements. That's very important. Stop there. Sorry.
Thanks. Swati, would you like to add something to that?
Sure. And you can come back with the question that you earlier raised. I didn't really fully get it. So I just want to follow up with and reiterate what Farzana is saying, which is that really at the end of the day, the minimum wage is an easier policy to do in some sense. That I want to understand why isn't it the national government, the central government taking the lead in terms of increasing that floor rather than leaving it just to the states who have much narrower budgets. We've seen how states have tried to do even state job guarantee programs, but with very limited budgets compared to what the national government can provide. And I want to end on a sort of somewhat positive note, which is that I have immense faith in the Indian government state capacity. The polio drive was something all of us saw. So why isn't there that level of urgency now for the pandemic as well as for the livelihood crisis attached to it?
Thanks, Swati. I would add to another question by Professor Chun Wanat. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, from Cambodia. He wants to know what are the long-term economic statecrafts to be worked out to stabilize labor market, particularly among young active Indians.
Can you repeat that, Shmita? Sorry.
Hello, can you hear me? Swati, can you hear me?
It's a bit unclear. Your voice breaks up a bit, so I'm not sure if I get the question.
Okay, so the question is, what are the long-term economics statecrafts to be worked out to stabilize labor markets among active young Indians?
So I think this is the big question we're all sort of grappling with. And broadly speaking, I can only give you the view that we're hearing from people themselves, which is in these low-income areas. And there seems to be sort of, yes, the cash transfers are reaching some proportion of them, about 13% is the number in our case. The ESIC and the EPFO schemes, which are more like hiring incentives at the moment, are also reaching some very, very small proportion of people. So at the end of the day, the exclusions that, Farzana has referred to in the past and that Mr. Deepak said as well, I think those exist, and which is why the universalization of the social safety net is really sort of what we're all hoping would happen to prevent a crisis.
Thank you, Swati.
I would add to what Swati is saying. If I look at the macro picture, then the crisis really boils down to the fact that we are going, incomes are shrinking, poverty is expected to go up, and we need to increase demand in the economy to give an incentive for businesses to start or restart, so to speak. And until and unless we have that demand coming, there would not be any employment generated. So if we want to think of this as a circle, then the first order importance here should be given to stimulating the demand. And demand can be stimulated only if we have a big fiscal stimulus. And I think we should look at many of the developed countries, for whom the pandemic may have been much less of a crisis. So for example, if you think of it in terms of the percentage of GDP, whatever the government has put through in the previous year or in the budget does not compare with what many other countries would have done at a level of the shock that is not comparable to what India is experiencing currently. So we need a sort of, what you would call a Marshall Plan for our times for India to be able to stimulate demand. And once we are able to stimulate demand, you will have businesses being interested, manufacturing being interested, and that is going to, when you reduce the uncertainty for the, the demand side, that's when investment starts, when employment gets created. And so I think that is, what is basic here that needs to be done. And I don't see that recognition, the recognition of that problem by the government. And this has been a part of the discourse since last year, unfortunately.
Thank you, Farzana. So there are a lot of questions. I will try to pick up some of them and address it to the panelists. So that I hope I am audible now and it is clear. So there is another question for Swati by Preeti Zanwar from Faculty Affiliate US Network on Life Course and Health Dynamics and Disparities. So she asks, can you clarify what you mean by cash transfers and what might be the implications for job loss on short and long-term health?
So I think this is a fairly well-established literature. I'm starting with the second question, which is about the consequences of job losses on individuals themselves as well as the community. And what we know is that when people fall into long-term unemployment, getting them back to work and getting them to have the same income trajectories that we would have thought they would have before is extremely difficult and often not possible, and which is why you see these people having lifelong employment and earning losses. What that also translates into, and we've seen this not just in developing countries like India, but in the US and the UK, that translates then into serious health questions, both in terms of substance abuse, mental health, the well-being of the community, crime. These are well understood sort of scarring effects from long-term unemployment. So let me come back to the first question that you did ask, which was specifically about the cash transfers. The cash transfers that we proposed, or rather that we inquired people from, were typically just sort of direct transfers from the government to the bank account, sort of like the examples that if they did ask us for what we were thinking of, we did explain to them about Jan Dhan, about the PM Kisan Yojana, about also saying that these were not sort of Ujjwala gas cylinders, which are in-kind payments, and these are not Narega payments for wages, which are something that you do in return for labor services that you're providing. So that's roughly what we think we were able to communicate, and it's very unlikely that people didn't understand that, since most people were quite aware of them.
Thank you, Swati. Another question I would like to ask Mr. Deepak Kumar Singh. This is a question asked by Deepak Rai, and he is asking, what would be the impact on the urban service class of COVID-19, as this middle class people are losing their jobs, mostly in the age bracket of 40 to 55, when they have most liabilities?
Yeah, Smita, I don't have the data because I don't have any access to any research work, but certainly what I can see from my experience is that it is not only the working class, the daily wage workers or the self-employed people, but it is also the middle class who were working. And certainly, I mean, this thing is true that many of them, based on their initial pay packet, had created many liabilities, and certainly nobody had foreseen the pandemic. And in the pandemic, they had lost their jobs, and it has put a big burden on them, and it is certainly resulted in mental stress on them also. The thing is that as our other panelists have pointed out, that it will take some time for the economy to come back, to bounce back to the same level. And we don't know whether when it comes back to the same level, the employment will also bounce back to the same level, because this pandemic has also taught one thing, both mainly to the employer, that working from home is a cost-saving device for them. And therefore, and when they work from home, then the job cutting, the requirement of the persons to be employed, that can be also one of the things. So what I think from my practical experience, of course, it is not supported by any data or any research, is that even when the economy bounces back to the same level, perhaps the employment would not bounce back to the same level again, as far as the middle class is concerned.
Thank you,
But
Mr.
I would
Singh.
be happy because the other panelists, they are much more, I think they would be able to answer it in a much more better manner.
Yes, so would any of the other panelists also want to respond to this question of this attendee? Otherwise, Clemo, do you have a comment?
No, actually, I wanted to answer a question that's been asked to me about the drop in salary jobs, and why is it still that there are few salary jobs in March, April 2021? And since that's very related to what's just been said, I thought I would just say a few words, if that's okay. So I mean, I think the workers the young workers we're looking at, the types of jobs they do are, if you want to think about it, the typical job is service sector job, is coffee day, okay? And the typical manufacturing job is a sewing machine operator in a textile industry. So if you take those two sectors, in the current situations in urban areas in India, the coffee days are probably not closed, or not making a lot of business if they're allowed to open. So the service sector has been really hit badly. On the manufacturing side, of course, in India is a vibrant export in textile. The international markets are just now starting to pick up again. But basically, yes. So on the demand side, and that's really also joining to what Farzana was saying, there's the demand isn't there from the employer side. So those jobs on there. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out, and that's perhaps thinking about the middle class versus the working class. What's very likely to happen is, as the economy bounces back, it will partly bounce back. The question is, as the jobs reappear, who will take those jobs? And so here, there's a few things that might happen. It could be that if there are fewer jobs available, these semi-skilled workers and workers with relatively little education will not get the jobs because workers with higher education will take them. Or urban-born workers will take the jobs that would usually be done by migrant workers. Or maybe workers from Tamil Nadu will take jobs that would usually be done by migrants from Orissa, for example. So there will be this competition on the labor market that will just push the poor and the more disadvantaged at the bottom in a situation where they can't get those jobs. And I think that's something we've it's a very well studied phenomena in any sort of crisis in labor markets around the world. This sort of competition, and this will happen. And of course, here, unfortunately, the crisis is hitting India as it is already in a situation where there are a lot of every year, young people entering the labor market, and there's not enough job for them. So that's just like amplifying the crisis is amplifying those problems that were already there. So I'll just end there.
Thank you, Clement. So are there any other if any of the panelists, if you feel that there are any other specific questions that are directly sent to you, please feel free to answer them if you would want. Otherwise, I would just point to some of the questions that have come. One question is asked by Sibabrata Chaudhary to all the panelists. Are there any studies regarding the access to the government measures by migrant workers or communities affected by lockdown? For example, migrant families might not be having PDS card or job card. So are there any studies available which looks into that?
There was this study that has been done by Azim Premji University, which is not a random sample, but it's it's based on people who were in need. It was specifically migrants who needed help, and they had a helpline. And then they would call them, and they also recorded information on demographics and so on and so forth for them. So that's one possible survey, but of course with the caveat that it's not a random sample, so it may not be representative of all migrants. But I don't think there is a study which focuses specifically on migrants, which might be representative. Of course, Clement might know better, but I can't think of any study off the top of my head.
Yeah, so one thing I can do is I'll show you what we have in our survey, which is a slide that I skipped, but maybe since there are a few questions on there, just want to, in our survey, which is not representative, and I think, sorry, I'm ramping up to my survey because I don't think there's any representative data there. So there's a few surveys, that show us some aspect, but on the sample that we had been looking at, it is the case that those migrants are in a very dire situation. And because they're migrants, they're away, it was very hard to get support from their family back home. And so they did not get help from their employers. The other thing, or few of them did, the other thing that there was, I think, interesting was that in principle, as salaried workers, they could have gotten money from their Providence Fund, but very few of them even knew they had a Providence Fund account. So even like those relatively privileged or secured workers actually don't know that they could have that. And then many of them relied on government assistance. However, this was emergency government assistance that haven't broken down there, but basically none of them were registered in local PDS. It was emergency local assistance. And, in the end, 1/3 of the migrants we have in our sample received no support at all. And 1/3 had to reduce their daily food intake during the lockdown. So I just wanted to give a few figures there, but it's in no way representative. I think I've highlighted how specific our sample is.
Thanks, Clement. Another question is addressed to Swati by Chandrasekhar. He wants to know, would a policy to bring maximum sustainable employment, use Federal Reserve's dual mandate, be applicable to India and provide equitable employment inclusion to minorities?
So I don't know the specific policy that you're talking about, but if it does look like a job guarantee, I can say something about that, which is to say that there's very high support, particularly amongst historically marginalized groups like scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and women who are from these communities, that there's a high willingness to pay for job guarantees, as well as there's higher take-up rates in many cases. So in that sense, it does tend to be equitable for the reason that it is universal. That's not to say that every program works great in India. Of course, there are still exclusions and omissions in India. But broadly speaking, I want to come back to actually, I think, what was a really important point that Mr. Deepak Kumar made earlier, that we've got to remember that we're talking about a country where, yes, places like Delhi look very modern and everything, but the fraction of people who are able to work from home is very small compared to most other sort of from a cross-country point of view. And much more importantly, in places, not just in the developed world, but even in developing countries, most people have abandoned austerity policies and have doled out a lot of money to put into active job policies so that they can prevent long-term unemployment. And that level of sort of commitment is sort of what's needed now, especially given what Farzana said about the scale of the shock, that we're talking about a really long haul displacement of individuals from work.
Thank you, Swati. So now I think I would not take any more questions unless the panelists feel that there is some question that is sent to them which they particularly would like to answer. Otherwise, I would just like to invite the panelists to give their closing remarks to this session. So I would start with Farzana. Farzana, your last.
I'll just very briefly say something here, which comes also from my own personal experience of what we are going through in India right now, is that we have not talked about health and we have not talked about public health. And public health and livelihoods are not actually divorced from each other. Given the way the pandemic is panning out now, whatever results we have here, what we are going to observe a few months down the line is going to be multiple times the shock that we saw last year. And each and every household is going to have somebody who would have suffered a health shock. We need to invest in public health long term, but in the short term, the vaccination has to be the centerpiece of the response of the government. 3 vaccines for everybody. And we have not moved towards that. Policy has not moved towards
that. Mr. Deepak Kumar Singh, would you like to give your closing thoughts on this?
Thank you, Asmita. I think I will come back to the same point which I had raised, because I I couldn't find any answer to that in the in what the panelists had presented, is about the what is the best measure to identify and register the unorganized workers. That is one thing. The second thing which is worrying is that while we are talking about the unorganized workers, at the same time we also have to recognize that the informalization of labor is an increasing trend, and it is not only in the private sector but also in the public sector, in the government as well. The informalization of labor is increasing, and the basic reason behind that is that uh, they find that in that way it is better, it will be easier to hire and fire the workers. They have to pay less and they have to take a less social security burden of that. So there is a dichotomy. On the one hand, we are talking about the welfare of the unorganized workers. On the other hand, the entire economy is moving more and more towards the informalization of the workers. So I don't know how that dichotomy can be resolved, because gradually the numbers will increase, and whatever the social security the government, the till now what the government of India has started, or some state governments have also started on their own. Kerala is given as a good example of that. But these measures are much less. They are not able to give a sustained kind of a livelihood, or they are not more than something more than actually just a sustenance level for the unorganized workers. In the same way, the minimum wages also. I mean, one of the panelists said that why can't government of India fix a floor wage of minimum level? In fact, that's a long-standing demand of all the labor unions, that government of India fixes up a minimum wages, because currently there is a large difference between the minimum wages across the states. And since I have been in the labor department, whose job is every 6 months to fix up the labor wages, we know that we mechanically fix it, not taking into account the actual livelihood needs of the workers, but it is just based on a formula of the VDA and based on what the Labor Institute they announces. So it is just based on that. So one thing would be the registration, and second thing would be that how to counter the increasing trends towards informalization of the economy and informalization of the working places. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Singh. Swati, would you like to give your closing thoughts at the key issues that you think needs to be changed?
I'm actually going to respond to Mr. Kumar for what he said, which I think is really pertinent. I don't have solutions for how you register people, but I do think that the second point he raised, which is that this is not a phenomenon which is just happening in India, but the whole informalization of work is really, really much more prevalent. And we've seen what's happening with the gig economy, for example, in the UK. So I think this is really a much bigger agenda, and we should be thinking exactly the way people were thinking in the 1920s or the 1930s, when many of these worker rights movements started, and they were really sort of about that time and age and what was happening. And I think we're back in that sort of moment. So new, fresh ideas, especially from young people who might be on this chat or on this meeting, that would be absolutely wonderful.
Thank you so much. Clément, please give your closing thoughts.
Yes, so I'll say that, I don't know how to register informal workers to social protection, but many governments know how to do it. So it is happening. It is done. It is done in India. It is done by states. It is done by national government and around the world. And many governments have been doing it increasingly in response to the COVID crisis. So, I mean, I've written a very short piece trying to make a summary of all the challenges around the world in developing countries for social protection. And part of the things we've discussed are the different ways in which registration can be done and expanded. The way, in short, the way it is happening is that the rights, the social protection is not connected to people's employment. It is connected to people's residence. And this is the way, every entitlement, which is the PDS or the NARIGA or any social protection program you see, are covering people in terms of where they live. which of course then raises the question of how do you cover migrants? And I think migrants really are, pointed at, are highlighted all the shortcomings of social protection programs around the world, but also especially in India. So you want social protection programs that exist in rural and in urban areas, and that where people can take their benefits with them when there's portability. So the PDS system is a good example of that. So I would say, the solutions are there. There needs to be ambition and money. And I'll just say the last thing about this ambition, which is there's a real issue now, which is the migrants are problems, or are really emphasizing this, which is the coordination and the cooperation between states. So the portability of rights and the fact that migrant workers are the responsibility of the states who send them, the responsibility of the states who welcome them or not, but and who give them employment because they need them. So I think this coordination across states is also something that's extremely important.
Thank you, Clément. I think we have managed to cover most of the important points that it's required to have a fiscal stimulus. We need to go for universal public health. I would just like add to this point by Farzana also that possibly education is another thing that we are ignoring right now, but there is this great divide also occurring in that sector, which is going to eventually affect the labor market in future. So we also need to think about universal free education and all other points about social security and safety nets that all the panelists have made today. So I would just bring this meeting to a close now, because we are already 1 minute past us, or 2 minutes past our stipulated time. I thank all the audience, and I thank particularly all the panelists and speakers today for taking their time out and presenting their results and giving their comments. I would like to remind you before the meeting ends that there is a brief survey that is immediately following today's presentation. So please take a minute to fill that out later on, as your feedback is very important to us. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ashmita. Thank you.
Thank you very much.